December 3, 1961, Ardennes Research Facility, 0720 in the morning. The fog lay low between rows of conifer and glass. The air smelled of wet pine and engine oil, and under a gray sky, a small convoy had stopped at the facility gate. A dark sedan idled with its engine whispering, the driver checking a pocket watch as if time itself were an accomplice to a pause. The man in the back seat folded his hands and did not move. He had been expected to step out, to walk across the concrete and pose for photographs that would symbolize an experiment reborn under civilian oversight. Instead, he remained seated, eyes fixed on the door that nobody else would cross for him. A junior photographer behind the glass pressed the shutter instinctively, and then lowered the camera, certain that the image would be worth more than words. That single hesitation contained years of promises made in private letters and meetings, where protocol and loyalty had been traded like currency. Why would a decorated military leader refuse the handshake meant to seal a transition between command and civilian control? What had hardened into a refusal was not merely pride, but a fracture that would reconfigure power in a nation still learning how to rebuild. On one side of this story stood General Elias Moreau, a soldier who had become a national symbol after leading counterinsurgency operations in the late 1950s, a man who carried medals, wounds, and the precise cadence of orders in his speech. On the other side stood Prime Minister Harold Beckett, an austere politician who had steered the post-war government through budget cuts, international negotiations, and the creation of a civilian research program meant to integrate former resistance units into formal defense institutions. The general had offered a face of competence and order. The prime minister offered legitimacy, parliamentary authority, and the patience of a statesman who had learned to weigh public trust above personal debt. They had once exchanged letters full of respect, invitations for counsel, and a secret plan to test a new model of civilian control over paramilitary units. The general had offered a face of competence and order. The prime minister offered legitimacy, parliamentary authority, and the patience of a statesman who had learned to weigh public trust above personal debt. They had once exchanged letters full of respect, invitations for counsel, and a secret plan to test a new model of civilian control over paramilitary units. Now they occupied different parts of a ritual that should have symbolized continuity. The question that followed them was simple and terrible. How did a partnership forged in shared peril become a rivalry that stopped a man from leaving a car? Over the next 40 minutes, we will reconstruct the precise sequence of choices and misread signals that led to that photograph and to the political earthquake that followed. We will read fragments of the letters exchanged between Moreau and Beckett, examine memoranda from staffers like Clara Voss and Raymond Klein, look at the photograph that ran on front pages, and hear from witnesses such as Anna Mayer, the journalist, Colonel Jean Dubois, the liaison, and Ambassador Samuel Ortega, who tried to mediate. We will follow the campaign that turned cooperation into accusation, the speech that was censored at its last moment, the images that aired across the country, and the funerals and reconciliations years later that tried and sometimes failed to heal an institutional wound. This is a tale about the fragile boundary between honor and ambition, between command and politics, and about how a single public gesture can calcify a private grievance into a national crisis. General Elias Moreau was born in a village that still smelled of coal smoke and bread. As a child, he learned to read the sky because his father was a telegraph operator who taught him to listen for shifts in weather and in rumor. In his teenage years, he joined local resistance groups, a decision that left him with both a medal and a scar above his left eyebrow. He trained in infantry tactics and later in counterinsurgency methods abroad, where instructors admired his calm under pressure and his insistence on small unit cohesion. Moreau rose because he combined fieldcraft with a reputation for fairness towards civilians in contested regions. When he returned home, he rejected offers of quick political positions, insisting instead on a chain of command that answered directly to national defense rather than to partisan favor. His reputation among soldiers was that of a man who lived simply and slept lightly, who tasted coffee black and preferred maps to opinions. Those who served under him spoke of the steadiness in his hands and the quietness of his laugh when the day was over. Prime Minister Harold Beckett grew up in a port city where his mother ran a small bookshop and his father was a union organizer. He studied law, then public administration, and entered politics through municipal office, where he became known for meticulous budgeting and a talent for mediation. In the national crisis following the war, Beckett had been the conciliator who brokered compromises between rival factions. He believed in institutions more than personalities, and often said that the country needed rules that outlived any one leader. His ascent to prime minister was slow and deliberate, shaped by small votes and larger negotiations with parties and diplomats. Beckett kept a tidy desk with legal pads of neatly crossed-out notes and a habit of drinking strong black tea while reading morning cables. To his critics, he was cautious, almost cold. To his allies, he was the steady hand that had kept the government functional during economic shocks and foreign pressure. Both men had been praised for restraint, but for different reasons. Moreau for his decisiveness in combat, Beckett for his patience in Parliament. Both backstories connected to the Ardennes Experiment in obvious ways. Moreau's battlefield authority made him the natural candidate to lead a program that sought to convert irregular units into disciplined brigades under civilian oversight. Beckett's institutional instincts made him the architect who insisted that any military integration happen within a legal and parliamentary framework. When the initial proposal was drafted, the two men exchanged letters that read like promises of mutual support. Moreau wrote of operational needs and the costs of disorder, while Beckett replied with protocols and assurances that the troops would gain pensions, training, and a clear chain of civilian accountability. Their early cooperation produced real results on the ground and a cautious optimism in foreign capitals. But as the program scaled up and became entangled with electoral politics, the private trust between general and prime minister was tested by public calculation. In private rooms, aides such as Clara Voss and Raymond Klein worried about optics. In public squares, critics accused the government of militarizing science and the military of politicizing sacrifice. The Ardennes Experiment that began as a technical integration thus became a crucible for character and power. The origin of the relationship had moments that were almost ordinary until they were not. It was a lecture at a military college where Moreau had been invited to speak on discipline, and later a closed session in the Prime Minister's office where Beckett listened and took notes. After the lecture, Beckett had stepped out into drizzle and found Moreau standing under a lone street lamp, wiping rain from his jacket. They exchanged a few sentences, then arranged a follow-up over coffee and an archive of field reports. In those first meetings, both men were earnest. Moreau asked for clear rules and commitments that would prevent political interference in troop movements. Beckett promised oversight and safeguards, and he wrote detailed minutes that he circulated among his top advisors. That early trust was cemented by an informal agreement to keep negotiations transparent to a small circle. Minister of Defense Clara Voss, Chief of Staff Raymond Klein, and advisors like Ambassador Samuel Ortega, who had experience negotiating between military and civilian actors. The language in those minutes was cautious but sincere, and it produced a credible pilot program in 3 regions. At the same time, small gestures that looked like courtesy grew into expectations that one of the two might fulfill favors for the other. Moreau declined political office repeatedly, insisting that his duty was to the uniform and not to banners. Beckett, in return, deferred control of certain appointments to Moreau until he was confident the program would reduce violence and ease demobilization. Those early accommodations were framed as mutual and pragmatic. Yet, from the start, there were whispers from opposition figures like Senator Julian Hart and journalist Anna Meyer that hinted at a mix of ambition and expediency. The first seeds of resentment emerged not from a big betrayal, but from a sequence of micro-refusals, deferred meetings, letters that arrived late, a promise of an advisory role that never materialized. Each refusal was small, but together they created a sense of being sidelined that, to a man who had led troops in the field, felt intolerable. The private tone of the correspondence shifted from collegial to terse, and the public silence grew louder. A series of offers and refusals accumulated into a pattern that hardened into suspicion. Beckett's office circulated memos recommending civilian oversight committees and strict transparency for. Moreau responded with annotated notes emphasizing speed and discretion in the field. Letters from Moreau to Beckett lay in a safe in the Prime Ministerial office and in another document drawer at the General's headquarters. One such letter read in part, "I cannot sign away the safety of men where there is no rapid command." Beckett wrote back, "The state must be the guardian of force, or else we become what we sought to defeat." These exchanged lines were proof of principle, but also of difference. Clara Voss wrote to Beckett expressing concern that some regional commanders were already acting in ways that blurred lines between national control and local loyalties. Raymond Klein cautioned that any public quarrel would be magnified by papers like the Evening Post and broadcasters such as Network 4, which had recently taken an interest in the Ardennes trials. Names such as Senator Julian Hart, Colonel Jean Dubois, Captain Marta Novak, and Ambassador Samuel Ortega appeared in margin notes as both defenders and provocateurs. The seeds of resentment were planted in formal channels and watered by rumors and leaks. Then came the campaign that exposed private grievance to public judgment. The opposition seized on the experiment as a case study of government overreach and painted Moreau alternately as a rogue commander and as the only man capable of restoring order. Media narratives polarized quickly, and candidates used the issue to score points in televised debates. Beckett insisted that the program be kept under civilian command, but offered Moreau an honorary advisory post that required regular reports to the ministry and a public oath to parliamentary oversight. Moreau viewed the offer as emasculating. In public encounters, the tension sharpened. In a town hall in Greenford, Moreau stepped onto the stage and spoke plainly about the need for decisive authority. Beckett responded from a distant lectern, emphasizing the rule of law. The campaign rhetoric turned private misgivings into accusations. In one particularly charged exchange, two campaign aides denounced each other on live radio. "You sell safety for votes," one said. "You sell loyalty for headlines," the other replied. The campaign made the question of who should command the experiment not a technical debate, but a moral contest over honor and legitimacy. The core moral center of the conflict crystallized in what the press later called the Ardennes hearing. The event had been scheduled as a public defense of the program and a chance to show how civilian oversight could protect veterans and scientists alike. The hearing was centered on a technical report by Dr. Emil Marshall, the lead scientist who had designed reintegration protocols, a man renowned for his measured voice and for decades of quiet scholarship. On the morning of the hearing, the auditorium smelled of dust and citrus from the fruit baskets arranged for dignitaries. Journalists rustled as they prepared notebooks, and a technician adjusted the microphone with a metallic squeak. Senator Julian Hart stood as an antagonist in the first row, while Anna Meyer sat near the front ready to ask precise questions. Beckett was meant to introduce Dr. Marshall and to endorse his work in measured terms that would undercut the harsher language of critics such as Hart. Moreau had his own speech prepared that praised Marshall but included operative caveats and a demand for immediate tactical authority in certain zones. In the hours before the hearing, an aide named Peter Lenz suggested softening Moreau's passage that implied the Prime Minister was delaying necessary moves. "It will look like a rebuke," Lenz warned. "The public will interpret it as a rift," Clara Voss said in a later memo. Nevertheless, the drafts were distributed, and in the green room there were a flurry of last-minute decisions as advisors argued over phrasing and citations. During the hearing, a technical paragraph became the fulcrum of history. Beckett had planned to read a passage that defended Marshall unequivocally and condemned opportunistic attacks on the scientist. Late in the night, Klein received a call advising the passage be shortened to avoid inflaming the opposition and to keep a coalition together. The shortened version removed explicit names and instead spoke in generalities. Moreau's speech remained intact and urged immediate measures that would bypass certain parliamentary procedures under emergency rules. The room hummed with the sound of whispered counsel. When the time came, Beckett took the stage and opened his speech with calm diction. He praised Dr. Marshall for his rigor and then, to the surprise of many, moved quickly to policy and coalition building. He did not read the excised paragraph. In his absence, the television cameras caught Dr. Marshall's face, which tightened as if he had been deprived of support. Later that evening, the footage was replayed with captions and analysis suggesting Beckett had chosen political stability over defending a civilian scientist. In the national imagination, the omission was a choice that could be interpreted as moral failure. The press ran headlined op-eds debating whether omission equaled betrayal. The removed paragraph circulated in leaks and was framed by rivals as evidence that Beckett would not stand up for civilians when it was risky to do so. At that moment, a tension erupted which lasted months and shaped public opinion. This was the first of 3 moments that would be remembered as turning points. In a short scene behind the curtains, Dr. Marshall confronted Klein. "Why was my name left out?" he asked, voice raw. Klein replied, "We feared the coalition would break." Marshall said, "A scientist's defense is not a bargaining chip." And Klein answered, "Politics is exactly a bargaining floor." This exchange showed the collision between principle and pragmatism and was recorded later in a private diary that would leak. The second tension point came weeks later in a speech in Montreuil, where Moreau publicly endorsed a senator who had criticized Beckett and accepted a photograph with that senator, smiling and grasping the general's hand. That image was carried on breakfast shows and interpreted as a defection. The third moment arrived on the day of the formal handover at the Ardennes facility, when the general refused the handshake and instead remained in his car. Each of these incidents would be expanded in the pages that followed, occupying political debate and the imagination of a nation. The moments of public crisis were accompanied by scenes that made the conflict legible. In Montreuil, a rally that was meant to be ceremonial became a test of loyalties. The air in the square was metallic and full of shouting, and the taste of bitter coffee lingered on the breath of aides who watched the televised replay. Journalists such as Anna Mayer recorded the crowd's mood and later wrote that the photograph of Moreau lifting his hand with Senator Julian Hart beside him felt like an alibi for those who suspected the general had political designs. Ambassador Samuel Ortega attempted to broker a meeting where both men could state positions without cameras. He arranged a dinner in which the clink of cutlery masked a more urgent exchange. Colonel Jean Dubois, who had served under Moreau and who had a reputation for blunt talk, argued privately that the general had been pushed into public gestures by a cadre of younger officers who feared losing influence. Captain Martin Novak, representing the integration unit, sat quietly in meetings and later testified that recruits had begun to pick sides in barracks. These named actors played roles that were specific and consequential, from whispers in editorial rooms to formal minutes in ministerial files. The photograph that defined the controversy was taken by Anna Mayer in that first week and published on the front pages the next morning. It showed Moreau flanked by Hart with a smile that historians later described as a photograph that crystallized a transition in public perception. The image was not decisive evidence on its own, but it functioned as proof for the narrative that Moreau had aligned with partisan forces. The Prime Minister's office received calls from foreign embassies and from domestic party officials who urged calm and clarity. In the following days, there were meetings that read like diplomatic communiques where each side tried to shape the story. Clara Voss wrote a public statement praising the science behind the Ardennes project and asked for an independent panel. Beckett held a press conference where he spoke of necessity and the rule of law, but also defended the right of the military to voice concerns. His voice was measured, but to many listeners it sounded like self-preservation rather than moral conviction. The press corps interpreted every pause as a signal and every edited paragraph as a judgment. Transition talks were arranged for the formal transfer of command in the capital. The day was bright and unnaturally crisp. The scent of citrus from wreaths at a nearby memorial mingled with the smell of polishing wax on ceremonial shoes. A convoy moved through a quiet avenue and reached the facility where a white ceremonial car was waiting to convey Moreau to his audience with the Prime Minister. Inside, a brief dialogue took place that would be transcribed later from several witness accounts and that for months dominated commentary. The exchange required many more direct lines than one might expect from a simple handover. "Do you plan to enter the hall?" asked Captain Novak, voice strained. "Yes," Moreau answered, then hesitated and added, "but only if the terms are clear." "The terms are in the memorandum," said Raymond Klein. "The memorandum leaves discretion," replied Moreau. "Are you refusing the right?" asked Clara Voss. "I am not refusing respect," Moreau said. "You will recognize me as a partner then?" Beckett interjected. "Recognition must be earned," Moreau replied. "If you sit there as a guest, I will be the one who walks in," Beckett said softly. "Then let it be clear who walks and who waits," Moreau answered. The dialogue continued with counterpoint and repetition for nearly 10 exchanges, each line a small pressure on protocol. The passengers felt the seat leather, heard the engine, tasted the metallic tang of tension. At the end, Moreau lowered his head, looked out at the closed door, and did not step forward. The silence was audible, recorded by microphones and by the rustle of papers in the Prime Minister's office. That brief refusal was photographed and broadcast, and within hours commentators called it an intentional rupture. One of the required interventions in the narrative is a pause where we invite you to reflect and to participate. You have seen the photograph and heard the excerpted exchanges that converted a working relationship into a symbolic rupture. What do you think mattered more in that moment, the public omission or the private accumulation? Did the Prime Minister fail a scientist when he shortened a speech, or did he preserve the fragile coalition necessary to govern? Which gesture is more unforgivable, the handshake with a partisan senator or the refusal to cross a door? Begin your comment with the phrase, "I am most struck by," and then name the gesture you think mattered most. Your perspective helps us understand how ordinary people interpret honor and power and can shape future episodes where we examine documents and letters more closely. We read the comments and bring your best points into future research. Now we return to the events and to the cascade that followed the photograph. The aftermath was a long, slow erosion of trust that produced legal inquiries, parliamentary hearings, and a surge of press speculation. Parliamentary committees summoned witnesses, including Dr. Emile Marshall, Ambassador Samuel Ortega, and Colonel Jean Toubois. Anna Meyer wrote a series of pieces that traced the correspondence between Beckett and Moreau and highlighted discrepancies in timing and tone. The opposition filed motions of censure that forced Beckett to defend the government in a televised debate where citizens were invited to call in. Moreau faced inquiries into his public endorsements and into orders that some regional commanders had issued without ministerial approval. The tension cut into defense budgets and foreign aid negotiations. Allies abroad asked for assurances that civilian control would be restored fully and soon. Internally, Beckett reorganized the Ministry of Defense and created an oversight panel led by Clara Voss and moderated by Ambassador Ortega. But critics argued the move was reactive rather than corrective. 3 moments of tension deserve fuller expansion because they shaped public memory in different ways and each occupied space where personal memory and institutional obligation collided. The first moment occurred during the Ardennes hearing when Dr. Marshall stood alone at the lectern and felt the absence of an explicit defense from the Prime Minister. The scene was small but devastating and would later be replayed as an example of what happens when political calculation displaces moral clarity. The second moment was the Montreal photograph, where Moreau accepted an endorsement that made him visible as a partisan ally and fed narratives that he sought political office through military prestige. The photograph functioned as a visual claim and confirmed suspicions among undecided voters. The third moment was the handover delayed by a man who would not cross a threshold that signaled civilian supremacy. Each moment occupied different media spaces, and each carried moral weight that fueled protests and parliamentary inquiries. Across months, the personal estrangement hardened. Moreau returned to the barracks and grew quieter. He signed a letter of resignation from the advisory role that had been offered, stating simply, "I will not be a figurehead." Beckett weathered the storm of criticism, but his party's approval ratings dipped, and a coalition that had earlier seemed durable was now brittle. Clara Voss and Raymond Klein played roles as stabilizers and communicators. They wrote memos that tried to translate military necessities into parliamentary language. Ambassador Samuel Ortega continued to mediate with foreign representatives and to urge calm. Colonel Jean Dubois kept his men focused on training, while Captain Martin Novak worked in the field to ensure recruits did not split along partisan lines. Anna Mayer continued reporting and later compiled a dossier that included leaked letters and private minutes, which historians would cite for decades. Time did what institutions sometimes require, but people often resist. A year after the handover, a small candlelight vigil for Dr. Emile Marshall's retirement produced a private meeting between Beckett and Moreau arranged by Ambassador Ortega. The meeting took place not in a hall, but in a chapel with the smell of wax and old wood and the muted sound of rain against stained glass. The exchange was short and laden with memory. "You once told me that institutions mattered," Moreau said, looking at a wooden bench. "I said so," Beckett replied. "Did I fail you?" Moreau asked. "You did what you thought necessary for order," Beckett answered. "I thought loyalty meant standing by a man who defended science," Marshall said from the side in a voice that had once led committees and now measured regret. The conversation was a slow negotiation of memory and a public attempt at reconciliation. It did not erase the photograph or the hearings, but it allowed both men a small private closure. Dr. Marshall would later write a brief public note thanking them both for their service and for the chance to continue his work under clearer rules. The institutional consequences continued. Parliament passed clearer statutes outlining the limits of emergency authority and the duties of civilian ministries toward scientific programs. The Ardennes Experiment remained active, but under a reform structure that included independent review boards, clearer budgets, and a transparent chain of command that required documentation for any paramilitary deployment. Legal scholars such as Professor Irene Solt and archival analyst Peter Lenz later wrote that the crisis produced a set of reforms that would shape civil-military relations for a generation. Yet, in the human register, the episode left wounds. Moreau retired to a smaller house and wrote memoir fragments that spoke of the smell of wet leather and the weight of metal in his palms. Beckett remained in office for another term, but carried the experience as a cautionary scar about when compromise becomes capitulation. In the funerals and the late reconciliations that followed, the two men rarely shared a platform. When Dr. Emile Marshall died 5 years later, there was a brief handshake on the steps of a cathedral between the two men who had once been allies and later opponents. The image of that handshake was softer than the photograph that had first scandalized the nation. It was accompanied by a headline that read simply, "Two men honor a scientist." A decade later, when Moreau passed away, the Prime Minister attended the ceremony and placed a wreath. In a private note, Beckett described Moreau as a man who carried his convictions heavier than his medals. Historians would debate whether the gestures of reconciliation were sincere or ceremonial, but for families and for those who served, the small acts mattered. They were not erasures, but acknowledgments that public life imposes accidents of fate on private loyalties. What remains is mixed. Institutional reforms brought clarity to the relationship between civilian authorities and military leadership, and the Ardennes Experiment continued as a model for integrating irregular forces into democratic structures. Yet the public narrative about loyalty and ambition persisted. The photograph, the excised paragraph, and the refusal at the gate became shorthand for a broader question. Can a democracy depend on men of action without letting action override law? The memory of the episode served as a warning about the costs when personal pride meets public power. It taught a generation of ministers and commanders that gestures can be as consequential as policy, and that the symbolic space of transitions is as important as the technical details they formally resolve. If there is a lesson, it is this: institutions require both the steadiness of administrators and the courage of leaders to defend principles, even when risky. Ardennes Experiment offered a rare field to test that balance and showed how fragile trust can be when it meets political calculation. It also showed how small human acts, a withheld paragraph, a pressed shutter, a refused handshake, can harden into canon. For those who study power, the story is a cautionary tale about humility and about the necessity of clear rules that bind not just bodies but also honor. If you found this reconstruction revealing, consider subscribing to follow investigations into decisions that shaped institutions and lives. Share your thoughts below, starting with "I am most struck by," and name the gesture you think mattered most. Your comment helps us frame future episodes and invites perspectives we might otherwise miss. We read and bring your best points into later research. In the end, the photograph remained a pivot, and the documents remained public, but time allowed small reconciliations that did not erase contradiction. The Ardennes Experiment survived as a program and as a story about the cost of power, about how private letters can become public proof, and how a single gesture can squander or preserve a legacy. The last recorded line in Moreau's private notes read simply, "Duty is a door I will open only with certainty." The last public line from Beckett in his memoir was, "I chose institutions, though the choice cost friendships." History keeps both lines because history remembers that choices are rarely clean and that the price of order sometimes sits at the threshold of a simple door.